Well, carrying on a tradition is basically using or interpreting what my father said and my forefathers said to express today. And it involves a lot of background, but it's what we feel today about what has happened in the past. So it's not only using the past, but also bringing my contribution into the tradition to help the tradition grow. I felt that within the world today and the technology, the influence of all that is changing the culture that I grew up with. So I wanted to preserve that and express myself and teach my kids where we come from, where I came from, the heritage of my forefathers. In terms of weaving, I'm a weaver, and my father told me I was the seventh generation, so I questioned that because there weren't any pictures or documents that said I was a seventh generation weaver. So my curiosity kind of took hold, and when I started weaving, I was just weaving to occupy time. And then as I grew older, I wondered where I came from, and then I started asking questions. And I took what I learned in weaving when I was 10 years old to start to interpret the culture and try to express myself as part of the culture, and also express things in the world that are happening, that were happening as I was going along. And that's all part of tradition. I mean, that's just, I don't know, that's just part of it. Well, the techniques that my great-grandfather and his father used were out of necessity, and that included raising the sheep and then shearing the wool and then washing the wool and then carding the wool to make a thread and then dyeing the wool using the natural pigments of the time, and then threading the loom, and then weaving the loom, weaving the piece, the weaving actual. And I had examples that were utilitarian, and most of the weaving here in my family was done as frazadas, and the frazada is a Spanish word for blanket. And that's those are all the processes that are required to make a frazada. My father gave me recipes for the native plants that he used to make the colors, and he was using imported dyestuffs as well as dyestuffs from the area, in other words, native plants. And the old pieces that I found, well, when we looked at museum collections, we found that indigo was one of the major dyes in the blankets, and mostly black and white wool with indigo. And then later on, in the late 1800s, there were aniline dyes, and the aniline dyes were more of a packet dye, like a RIT dye, and they obtained colors that they couldn't obtain with the natural substances. And then commercial yarns came about with the American colonization here in Chimayó, and they were bringing yarn from back east, from the mills back east, and those colors changed. And basically my tradition is being able to use all the colors from that spectrum. So not only natural dyes, but powder dyes, and using commercial yarns as well. My father was an instructor and a master weaver before World War II, and I knew weaving was in my family, but I really didn't know that my father was a master, and he was a teacher of all the technique. So in order to take from the loom all the way, and the sheep all the way to a finished piece. And my father started working in Los Alamos at the laboratory because he wanted to earn money to start his own studio and shop. And he ended up staying there because the schools were some of the best in the state of New Mexico. So we were brought up in the scientific world and the scientific culture, and then on weekends we'd come here to Chimayó, which was the Spanish culture that had been maintained pretty much. And so when I was told I was a 7th generation weaver, I started kind of wondering, but I was only 10 years old, and my father used to come home and he had a loom set up in my sister's bedroom, and that happened when my sister went to college, and she left the room, empty. So my dad put his large loom there, and I came home. During the summer, I just stayed at home. There wasn't anything to do in Los Alamos except ride my bike around, and my dad would come home from work and then he'd start weaving on this big loom, and then he'd come and eat dinner and then go back to weave, and he'd weave till like 10 o'clock at night. Well, I heard all this racket that the loom was making, and I went over to see what he was doing, and it looked interesting, so I just stood there and watched him. And after a while he asked me if I wanted to learn, and I told him that I did. And he said, okay, well, let me put you a chair, because I couldn't reach the loom. So I was standing on a chair, and I started to weave tapestry, which is a technique to place design in the blanket. And after about 2 weeks of weaving with him in the evening, then he asked me if I wanted him to set up my own loom. And so that's how I started. And I started basically learning how to throw the shuttle, and then I started to learn how to lay out letters, and I wove a piece for my sister Pat, which is only 3 letters, and so I wove the letters in the blanket. They were small, what we call conguitas, which are small weavings. And this 3rd piece I did with my name, and it was more embellished, more traditionally influenced in terms of the design. And then I showed it to some of my friends, and they wanted their own name in a weaving. So I started to work doing that. And then the summer, I wove about 50 pieces. They were small 20 by 20 weavings. And my father said, well, maybe we can sell it to a dealer, a blanket dealer. So we went to one of the dealers here in Chimayó, and we asked him how much he would give me for these pieces each, because there was like 40 pieces, and he said he could give me 90 cents for each piece. And I was taking about an hour to do each piece, and I got to where I was pretty quick. And the minimum wage at that time was $2.35. And I remember this because my dad said, well, let's just go off and sell it by ourselves. So we went to a crafts fair in August when I was almost ready to go back to school, and I sold all 40 pieces in 2 days, and I sold them for $10. So what I eventually learned as I got older is that weaving an individual design, not copying the design over and over, was more attractive to people, because people didn't want to buy the same thing just done over and over. And my dad's philosophy in designing was to weave a new design every time I got to the loom. And what I realized in doing that, I developed a vocabulary for designing. So when I was 10 years old, I was experimenting with designs and trying all kinds of things. And my dad, I remember when my dad said on this one piece that the piece looked like a flying saucer. The design looked like a flying saucer. So they were just forms like that, little forms, little designs. And then as I grew older, I started to learn how to weave wider pieces. And I eventually learned to weave the blanket size piece, which was 54 inches. And now I weave up to 12 feet wide. So it's all been a learning process, and that's how I learned. And I'm still learning. So the industry here in New Mexico, the earliest documentation is around 1630. Well, the sheep came with Coronado in 1538, around there. I can't remember the exact year. And he brought about 4,000 sheep. And it was mostly to feed the soldiers that he brought. And the sheep, they were churro sheep, which was the peasant breed out of Spain, and they were used for meat. And so the industry here in New Mexico developed as a meat industry. The sheep were used for meat, and the sheep were taken back to, like Durango, they had a stockyard, and they would sell them to Mexico City like that. Anyway, so the early Spanish weaving didn't occur until like in the 1800s. Like most of the pieces in the early days were more utility pieces, like what we call a frazada again, and the frazada is mostly stripes, very simple stripe. A lot of the utility pieces are either white background wool, white wool background, or a dark brown or black wool background, and these were the earliest influences in the designs. So most of the designs were done with the shuttle, the stripes, and so the pieces were mostly a series of stripes in the blanket to make a big piece. And this was Spanish period, what I call Spanish period. This area became Mexico in 1821. So Chimayó was Mexico in 1821. And so one of the influences was the sarape, the saltillo sarape. And the sarape was a wearing piece, and this was in the south. And they were worn by the caballeros, which were the horsemen in the hacienda, and they were pretty important. And the sarape was a status symbol, because the weavings took quite a long time to accomplish. Those weavings start to show up in northern New Mexico and were woven with the thicker wool as a blanket. So the use was for a blanket, but the design influence was from the diamond and the border around the outside from the saltillo sarape. And then when the Americans come, Santa Fe Trail opens up in 1825, and Mexico allows trade with the Americans, which the Spanish did not allow trade with the Americans. So when that trade developed, then the influence from the Americans start to happen, and this area becomes territory of the United States in 1846, I think. And so one of the things that the traders from Missouri coming into Santa Fe, they started to bring commercial yarns. So commercially spun yarn in factories or mills back east. And originally in the 40s, 1840s, they were bringing back yarn from Germany. And then eventually a lot of the Germans, they ended up in Philadelphia in a place called Germantown. And there was a mill there that they started to ship the wool from this mill out here to New Mexico. And it became known as Germantown. And one of the things that developed during that period is the use of the 8-pointed star. You can see it back here. Mm-hmm. And those are what we call valleros. The valleros. The Trompas Vallero has the 4 stars in the corner of the blanket and then one in the center. And then later on, when the railroad came in 1880 to New Mexico, they started to bring tourists. And what happened is they started to weave smaller pieces for different function other than the blanket, the big blankets. So they start to weave what they call conguitas in Spanish, and they're small weavings, scarves and table runners, and they started what's known as the Chimayó blanket. And the Chimayó blanket is a style that has 2 stripes and then a center design, and the bigger pieces have 2 smaller designs on the outside of the large design in the center. And this is a style that was developed by my father's generation. So the earlier Mexican style probably was woven by my grandfather, but I don't know. They did weave. I have examples of the stripes. So the early blankets, that's what I have example of. And what I learned about the tradition is that the culture changed with all these changes in who owned the land. And the influences changed the designs due to necessity to make a living. Mm-hmm. So at first they were just clothing themselves and feeding themselves off the land and the animals, the sheep. And the technology that comes from the Americans changed the culture, and then the tourists changed the nature of the weaving, and what we do today, or what I do, is to express those changes in my pieces. And I play music, I play drums, and weaving is very rhythmic. It has a lot of numbers, and drumming has a lot of numbers as well. And I count threads, so I count, like, for instance, the number 12 can be divided into 2, 6, 3, and 4, or 12 and 1. And so those numbers can be carried in designs, changes in number of threads, and kind of mix it up to make a design. The early inspiration was my father's philosophy, because he didn't have any drawings, or he didn't take pictures of his weavings. My grandfather, we only had a few examples left. So those were inspiration. And when I got married to my wife Lisa, we started to do research in museum collections. So that influenced our vocabulary in designing. We didn't copy the old pieces, but we used the ideas from pieces to create our own designs. And then I started to sketch, like in the 1980s, make these little fingernail sketches. And later on, I started to use those sketches in my pieces. During that time, when I weave, I always listen to music, and so I started to incorporate or name the pieces after the music that I was listening to. And so I've done pieces with David Bowie, Santana, John Lee Hooker, Tattoo, which is the T-A-T-U, which is a group from, I think, Russia, that my daughter used to listen to. And so I would hear her music, and that's about it. The other inspiration was the cultural part of my heritage. So like the entrega is something in a Spanish wedding where one of the families will introduce their family to the other family in verse. And so it's a verse that's made up by the musician, the lead singer, and he will describe, like, Uncle Joe and Aunt Vija and whatever to the other. And Uncle Joe, he used to raise cattle, or things like that. Anyway, so I did a piece called the entrega, and it's la entrega in Spanish. And I've done another piece that let's see, there was a midlife crisis, and the theme was cars, because I was looking for something to weave. And what I did is I stood still here in the studio, and I listened for sound. And the only sound I ever heard was the cars passing by. And I started to think about how cars influence our lives. And in the early stages of life, like when we're teenagers, we want the sports cars like that. So, MG or Corvette, things like that. And then later on in midlife, we have to work. So the truck in our culture is used to work. So most of the people own trucks because they throw stuff in the truck from the farm or whatever. And then the old age for me was represented by a hearse. And it was just what the hearse was used for in old age. And then death, to me, was the space shuttle. And boy, I did that. I really don't know. I have an engineering degree, and I kind of thought that technology, uncontrolled technology, will basically destroy us. And then after death, I started to think about, well, what happens after death? And I represented that with a dove, a white bird. And then up at the top of the piece, I have two birds talking to each other. And basically, it's one bird telling about their path and their life to the other bird. And that's kind of like the vereda, which is the path. That's the path of life. And then later on, I've done more modern tapestries for hanging, and those were from sketches that I did. And you can see some of the sketches and the finished pieces, like what they turned out. I've thought about what purpose I was here for, and I really feel that in my career as a weaver, I was entrusted with the tradition to put our culture through the new millennium. Not through, but into the new millennium. And to guide the young people, the development of my culture and my influences in the tradition as it grows. So the thing that I would want to leave is the ideas that are in the pieces that I've woven. And also, one of the things that I think is really important is to learn about the heritage of a person's heritage. In other words, I started asking questions to my aunts and uncles. My grandmother, she passed away before I got older. I only have recuerdos, which are memories, of her telling us stories in Spanish. And when my father passed away, I started to ask questions about the history of the industry and how our family was involved in the weaving industry. And so I did a lot of interviews in Spanish, and then I translated the Spanish to English, because when writers usually take a text in another language and they interpret it without knowing the language, the feeling is lost like that. And I wanted to capture the feeling, and so that was really important for me. And I have tapes and CDs to give to my kids, and we wrote a book to put the oral history that I'd been given, so that my kids knew, the whole tradition. I mean, their heritage and how the heritage changes, like that. And I think that's the most important part for a person to realize and to learn about. I think the most important part of my tradition is to learn it and trying to express what I've learned is very important to me. And I've expressed my heritage through my weaving and all my influences in my life. And it was very important to me to make a dent or a drop in the bucket as far as what my contribution or ideas were in my pieces. And they were expressed in a book that my wife and I, my wife wrote pretty much, and we hired a writer to write in English. Anyway, so we left the book so that my kids would know where they came from, and that's it. Thanks. The important part of my life was to express my heritage and to learn about my heritage. And I feel that that's one of the most important parts of life, is to learn where I came from, and where my forefathers, what they had to go through to get to where I am. So the most important part of what I've done in my life so far is to learn about my heritage and to express it, so that people can look at my weavings and my work and learn a little bit about where Chimayó comes from and where the people in Chimayó come from in relation to its history. So what I've experienced in life is the influence of all the cultures of my heritage and how it pertained to me in Chimayó, living in Chimayó. And I want my kids to remember where they come from and allow them to go into the future, into their lives, and express themselves. And there's no telling what will come out in the interpretation, and that's really important, is not knowing. Because it's like the interpretation and what I thought with all this, what I learned and what I thought and how I expressed it. And then allowing my kids to express themselves, as opposed to tying them down and say, this is your tradition, you have to do it this way, or it's not right. And that's, in my upbringing, my dad let me do or weave what I wanted. He didn't say you have to weave a red piece with white and black, or he kind of gave me philosophies on designing. Like I say, finding a new piece. Well, peace can mean peace of mind and peace of weaving, and that I've made that analogy. I told it in the Library of Congress in front of a bunch of people, and these were people from the city, and they were talking, and I was sitting up at the podium, standing up at the podium, and I was talking to these people, and I said, well, one of the things is to find a new piece with each weaving. And I stopped. So, I mean, like I said, standing here, there's not much happening. I can hear the fluorescent lights, the buzzer on the fluorescent lights, but I don't know. So I think the most important part of a tradition is to learn it and express what you learn in some form, either working for a firm in Wall Street or weaving blankets in Chimayó. Some people express through creativity their heritage and where they come from. And even the modernists, they came from somewhere. And all of what they learned is expressed through their work. And I think that's what an art form does, is to help a person express themselves. So for me, expressing the heritage and the tradition has been through weaving. And that incorporates the culture, my life, the music that I listen to, the colors that I see from anime in Japan, Walt Disney. It's like everything. Let me tell you the story, even though you want. I used, when my kids were small, I used to lay on the couch because I was really depressed, and I would watch the cartoons that they were watching, and I started to notice that Japanese aesthetic and color is a lot different than American color. And my dad used to say that color was the most important part of the piece. So it wasn't materials or technique, it was color. And not necessarily, you could do in black and white or color. And the whole weaving industry has been changed by colors. Wars have started with color. The Civil War was about indigo, the production of indigo. That's what the slaves were working on, indigo farms, as well as tobacco farms. And there's been, in Haiti, if you look at the flag of Haiti, there's a picture of a tree. And the tree is campeche wood, or logwood, what they call logwood. And in the early days, the Dutch and the English and the Spanish were all fighting for access to that dyewood to take back to Europe. When the Spanish came to Central America, they started plantations to raise indigo to take back to Europe. The English, on the same time frame, they went to India to do the same thing. And they were both vying to get to Europe the first, because that indigo market was really a lucrative market like that. And cochineal, used for reds, that was the third most valuable commodity traded. In other words, gold was the most valuable, silver was the next most valuable. Cochineal, the red dye, was the next most valuable commodity traded to Europe from the New World. And that says something about color. It's really amazing. Yeah, what it represents. Like red in the crimson uniforms of the English military, or the cardinals, cardinal red, like that. It's an important part of expressing the status of a culture. There's a lot of things that I've learned that, like maybe an artist coming from an art school would do, but I'm trying to make a living, and I know more or less my limits in terms of, I could stay here for a year on a piece. and whether I could sell that piece. It takes me sometimes several years to sell a piece, and sometimes it doesn't. Like, let's see. This a metaphor for the loom. The Spanish were come in and settle, and the looms, the old looms, are like big old posts, and they put them in the ground. Whereas Navajo looms are nomadic. So it kind of goes with their culture. They move. They're not set in. So I like using a lot of color. A lot of Hispanic weavings in the early days, they're very depressed in terms of the use of indigo and black and white wool. But the later, as soon as the dyes are introduced, where they could get brighter colors, they started making these screaming pieces. I think, in general, it shows the temperament of the person weaving. And actually, weaving was really important during the Depression because there wasn't any other jobs. And there was, in the late 30s and early 40s, there was a tie industry. There were 30 companies between Albuquerque and Santa Fe. And they were selling hand-woven ties. And there's a lady that started to weave them again. And we had like equipment that, there was a couple of people in Albuquerque that they were grandkids of the people who originally made the ties. They had all this equipment and they couldn't make a go of it, so we bought the equipment. We had it in the garage, and finally this lady was interested, so we actually just handed the equipment to the person. So that's part of the heritage that hasn't really been documented. In 1822, when after it had become Mexico, they took a census, and in that census they found there was 70 working looms in Albuquerque and only 14 looms over here that were listed. In other words, most of the industry was in Albuquerque.
When he gets a little further down, he goes across the threads to his hands.